Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome back to AJ 101 Criminal Law Online. And tonight's lecture is going to cover Chapter 15, and we are going to cover robbery and extortion. And fairly long chapter, so please bear with me, but we'll try to hit some of the highlights on a lot of these different topics that we're going to go over tonight. And again, I would suggest that you do the terminology quiz along with reading the chapter in your textbook, because I think that would help. So before we get going and we define what robbery is, and you can see the slide up already, and you can kind of take a look at it, but at common law, okay, because we always like to kind of go back, give you a little bit of history here. Robbery was a felony crime against both the person and the property of another. Then, as it is today, robbery amounted to the taking of the personal property of another from the victim's person or immediate presence by things like violence or intimidation and against the victim's will. Robbery is distinguished from theft, okay, in that theft or larceny is an offense against property. Robbery is classified as a crime against persons in the penal code because of the grave danger to which a robbery victim is subjected. In robbery, it's necessary that the taking be done with force or fear against the victim's will and from the person or immediate presence of the victim, as outlined in People versus Jones. Now, the vast majority of robberies are committed by armed suspects between the ages of, say, 16 and 25, many of whom are drug users. So because a lot of times those drug users are looking for money in order to get their fix, get their high, or what have you. And it'd be the same thing with a lot of theft suspects or even burglary suspects are drug abusers, because that's how they're going to finance their purchase of narcotics or what have you, by stealing items and selling them and similar. So what is robbery? What is it actually? Robbery is the felonious taking of personal property in the possession of another from his or her person or immediate presence and against his or her will, accomplished by means of force or fear. Now, there are definitely elements to this, and as you can see here, robbery again is distinguished from theft as a crime against person due to the danger of force or fear. So theft is a property crime, and robbery, on the other hand, is a person crime. And robbery includes as necessary elements the specific intent. Okay, and we talked about intent. To deprive the owner of his or her property, and the crime must include that word that we talked about already before, asportation. Okay, which means what? To move, to take, taking and moving. Okay, the suspect must have actually taken or acquired dominion or control over the property of the victim before the crime is complete. In other words, a theft must have occurred. Now, the corpus delicti of robbery may be proven by circumstantial evidence. Thus, where the victim is assaulted and rendered unconscious and awakes with his property missing, it may be properly inferred that the elements of robbery have been established, and that's People versus Hubler, Hubler. And we'll talk about the elements of robbery in just a few minutes. So kind of a little bit of review here. Robbery requires specific intent. We talked about that, to deprive the owner of their property. The taking of the property includes two aspects, and I kind of went over. There's the first one we call caption, or taking control of, gaining possession. The second is the word you've heard before, asportation, meaning carrying property away. The taking must be accomplished by the use of force or fear. Without asportation, the crime of robbery is not complete. But if you look below, you get an example here in People versus Quinn. California courts have held that forcing a victim to throw a wallet on the ground is in fact asportation, even if that suspect fails to pick it up. So just kind of a couple of extra little tidbits there. And we'll kind of move on. Well, let's look at the elements real quick before we talk about that immediate presence thing. So the essential elements, or what? Corpus delicti. Remember, we talked about that word a lot. Of robbery include taking, okay, or theft, if you want to say that, of personal property of some value in the possession of another, okay, asportation, from the person or immediate presence of the victim against the victim's will, meaning without their consent, accompanied by means of force or fear, violence or threatened violence, okay, and intent to permanently deprive the owner of possession or withhold possession for so long a time as to diminish the value to the owner. Now, the taking part, okay, we talked about that. It was that, remember, caption, okay? So the taking of property includes two aspects. Caption, again, which refers to gaining possession, and asportation, we know, which means to carry away. So again, that has to happen along with the force or fear, okay? And without asportation, as we've already talked about before, that crime is not complete. Now, it could amount to an attempt if you don't get the carrying away, but it kind of that really sort of depends. The courts have held that forcing the victim, again, to throw a wallet on the ground is asportation, even though the suspect failed to pick it up. People versus Quinn. To support a conviction of robbery, there must be a taking of personal property which is in possession of another from his or her person or immediate presence, and although some asportation is required, the distance of the property taken may be very short. The fact that the defendant and his partner refused the wallet taken from the victim and did not preclude a finding that the victim had actually been robbed. So just a couple of little things for us to kind of remember. So now what about this immediate presence? Because it says in there in the section, it talks about that immediate presence thing. So in robbery, the taking must be either from the owner's person, we got that one, we know what that is, or in his or her immediate presence. Well, what does that mean? Well, the term immediate presence provides some flexibility to that definition of presence, if you will. So an example, tying an owner in one room and taking money from a safe in another room constitutes immediate presence, if that helps you kind of clear it up. And robbery committed within the hearing or perception of the victim who is restrained nearby would also constitute immediate presence. And then how about against the victim's will? So kind of as we did in the other chapter, we're going through these fine points that talk about taking of personal property in the possession of another from the person's immediate presence against his or her will, accomplished by means of force or fear. So we're kind of going through these little pieces one at a time. So let's look at, now against the victim's will. The element of consent is lacking in the crime of robbery, right? Okay, so meaning you don't want to give people stuff when they are going to take it from you. So the element of consent is lacking in the crime of robbery. This is what distinguishes robbery from the crime of extortion. Okay, because in extortion, maybe by threat, you're going to willingly turn stuff over. You're going to consent and give somebody something so they don't do something else. So that's more of an extortion. Here, again, the element of consent is lacking when the crime of robbery occurs. When the victim is unaware of the taking of property by reason of the suspect, i.e., let's say the victim is knocked out and then the person takes their wallet, it's still robbery. In cases where absence of will is brought on by the victim, let's say voluntary intoxication, and property is taken off of the victim's body or immediate presence, it's not robbery, okay, but it could be grand theft or petty theft. So does that kind of clear things up a little bit? So here, if you're so intoxicated you can't consent, or you really don't know, okay, where there's no, you've got that absence of will, if you will, and that's brought on through intoxication, then you're going to end up with something like a grand or a petty theft versus a robbery. So fear in robbery is defined in Penal Code Section 212, and the fear of an unlawful injury to the person or property of the person being robbed or of any relative or member of his or her family. The fear of an immediate and unlawful injury to the person or property of anyone in the company of the person robbed at the time of robbery, and that kind of defines fear, because some violence, fear or intimidation must be used in the taking of property by robbery, or the crime is merely theft. Thus, while pocket picking, if you will, or purse snatching are grand theft, being thefts from person, such are generally not robbery unless sufficient force or fear is added and can be proven. So a little bit more, whenever there's a struggle, though, by the victim to keep his or her property, or if it is detached by force, for instance, a purse strap broken in a purse snatch, there is sufficient force there to constitute a robbery. So again, hopefully that kind of clears things up. Intimidation or putting in fear will supply the requisite fear in the commission of robbery. It must be remembered, however, that the crime does not require both force and fear, but force or fear. So one element may operate independently of another. It's also been held that threat of violence must be such to create a reasonable apprehension of danger, or it is not sufficient to make taking robbery. And such fear need not be of personal nature, kind of as we've read. It may be instilling fear of burning one's home or somebody's office or something like that. The fear in robbery may be directed to another person who is present at the time of the commission of the robbery. Thus, where the victim, a relative, or another person in his company is threatened, should the victim fail to comply with giving up his property, that too would be robbery. The crime of robbery is complete when money and property are taken from the person or immediate presence, accomplished by force or fear, and the crime does not become incomplete by the intervention of police officers, as long as those essential elements of the crime are satisfied. So that's kind of the information a little bit on that. And then we have force or fear. We kind of talked about that a little bit. Some violence, fear, or intimidation must be used. Thefts from a person, pickpocketing, really isn't enough to substantiate robbery unless there's force or fear. We talked about threat of violence, and then we talked about if a person forcibly takes property under a good claim of right, even if mistaken, it can be defense to a robbery charge, but only a defense. And once an act of asportation, taking, has occurred, the crime is complete, even if they decide, hey, you know what, we want to give the property back. So just like in burglary, we're going to see that there's a couple of degrees of robbery. And there are attempts as well, but let's kind of look at the degrees of robbery. Under Section 212.5, robbery is divided into 2 degrees. First degree, which would be robbery of a bus, a streetcar, a taxi cab, driver, or etc., or passengers in any of these vehicles. Robbery perpetrated or carried out in an inhabited dwelling, like a residential robbery, or robbery where using or after using an ATM machine. So if you just took money out of an ATM machine and you're walking away and you are robbed there, that would be a first degree example. Now, second degree, all other robbery not stated above would in fact be second degree. Well, what about attempts? And how does that kind of fit into the equation here? Well, when the intent to commit robbery is evident and the robber has taken an act towards the act, he or she can be convicted of attempted robbery. Now, mere preparation here is not enough to meet the attempted robbery standard or requirement. The suspect or the assailant must be what they call dangerously close to completing the crime or in the final commencement. Okay, but just mere preparation is not really going to be enough to meet the elements of robbery. So as we're talking about that, and we talked about fear and force of fear, and we even mentioned a little bit about returning property. Keep in mind the intent in robbery. So to constitute any theft offense, including robbery, the perpetrator must have specific intent to deprive the owner of the property either permanently or for that substantial amount of time. So what about the property though? I mean, does it have to be something, or does it really matter, like the value of something? Well, in robbery, the amount and value of an item of personal property taken is pretty much immaterial. The value of property really only need be slight. Okay, the property does have to have some legal value, but it doesn't have to be expensive. Okay, the person being robbed doesn't have to be the owner of the property to be the victim. So if you have someone else's cell phone and you are, let's say, robbed at gunpoint or knife point, and they take that, you are technically the victim of that robbery. Okay, when robbers confront several people during a robbery during one incident, a separate charge of robbery can be charged for each person that they take property from. So if there's a group of individuals, let's say, and one robber, and that person takes money from each one of them, or confronts, several people during a robbery during this one incident, a separate charge of robbery can be charged against, for each individual, if that makes sense. So a couple of miscellaneous sections that are in there, and I'll leave these for you to kind of look at. So if you look at page 34 or 234 and 235, you will see things like train robbery. Carjacking has its own separate section involving a vehicle. Inflicting great bodily injury, armed with a firearm or deadly weapon, use of a firearm. So in some of these are, like they say, they're enhancements. The sections are quite a bit more severe for train robbery and carjacking and inflicting bodily injury and armed with a firearm. So there are other things that will increase. Okay, so let's look at the firearm one, for example. So if any person committing a felony is armed with a firearm, every principal is subject to an additional sentence enhancement. Okay, 1 additional year for most firearms, 3 years for assault weapons or machine guns. So you can see how it will increase it. Use of a firearm. Personal use of a firearm during a robbery, okay, or other felonies adds a mandatory consecutive term of 10 years imprisonment. Personal discharge of a firearm during the robbery requires a consecutive 20-year term, and if great bodily injury results other than to an accomplice, an enhancement of 25 years to life applies. So you got to think about that. Why do you think that bank robbers sometimes use notes, and they bring a note and they pass it across the counter? Because if they get caught, then they're not going to get the firearm enhancement, which actually is quite a bit. So you can see, not just armed with a firearm, that one's not quite as much, but the use of a firearm could actually add a lot of time to somebody's sentence should they be caught and convicted. So what's the difference then, robbery, carjacking, since I mentioned that a second ago? So why is carjacking a different crime than robbery? Well, Robbery requires the specific intent to permanently deprive the owner of his or her property by force or fear. Now, carjacking requires the taking of a motor vehicle, so we're very specific here, intending to permanently or temporarily deprive the victim by force or fear. Now, carjacking has the same maximum penalty as first-degree robbery. It's in one of those first-degree categories, and that would be 9 years in the state prison. So punishment for robbery, well, it's punishable as follows. Robbery of the first degree by imprisonment in the state prison for 3, 4, or 6 years. However, if the robbery is committed by 3 or more persons in concert, punishment is 3, 6, or 9 years in prison. Robbery of the second degree by imprisonment in the state prison for 2, 3, or 5 years. Now, notwithstanding Penal Code 664, attempted robbery is punishable by imprisonment in the state prison. So you can see how that goes. Now, so we've pretty much got robbery, I think, down pat. Now let's move over to the other half of the chapter, if you will, and talk a little bit about extortion. So Penal Code 518 defines extortion as the obtaining of property of another with his or her consent, or obtaining an official act of a public officer induced by a wrongful use of force or fear, or under color of official right. And I know that sounds kind of legal ease-ish, so let me try to clear it up. So extortion, let's see a good way for me to get this to you. Extortion is the obtaining of property from another with his consent, or the obtaining of an official act of a public officer induced by a wrongful use of force or fear under the color of official right. So the crime of extortion, which is frequently called blackmail, you've probably heard that, is closely akin to robbery in many aspects. The essence of the offense of extortion is that it results in unlawfully obtaining something of value by wrongfully using force or fear. Okay, the statute covers the crime of obtaining money or property from another with the victim's consent. The victim's consent, of course, is obtained by force or fear. So does that kind of discern between now robbery and extortion? The origin of the term blackmail has kind of an interesting history, if you will, if you're a history buff like me. So like wealthy knights of old war gilded armor with fancy chainmail, and poor knights wore black armor with black mail, if you will. It was the custom that any knight knocked off his horse in a tournament lost his horse to his opponent. A few, especially crafty jousters back then, donned black armor, unhorsed the richest of those knights, and sold the prize horses back to the knights who lost them. The scam became so common that it was given the name later to mean something else, but it was called blackmail. Okay, the difference again between robbery and extortion is slight and amounts to the element of consent on the part of the victim. Consent, as previously pointed out, is given in response to that suspect's threat, usually to expose the victim to something that he or she doesn't want to know. So like, if you don't pay me $200, I'm going to tell your employer that you did this, or I'm going to tell your spouse that you did this, or your business partner that you did this. That would be an example of exposure. So that threat of exposure is kind of what it's really all about. And there's also one more thing that I'll kind of mention real quick under threat of exposure. There's a thing called the Badger game. And the Badger game is a type of an extortion trick, usually in the form of enticing a man into a compromising position with a woman whose real or pretended husband comes upon the scene and demands payment under the threat of prosecution or exposure. And such a threat is sufficient under this section to constitute the crime of extortion within the meaning of section 518 and 519, and that's kind of the Badger game. So kind of an interesting thought, and that's why, again, reading your book is kind of cool. So we talked about it already, but we're gonna kind of push on through the crime of extortion, frequently called blackmail, closely akin to robbery. Extortion results in the unlawful obtaining of something of value by wrongfully using force or fear. The statute covers the crime of obtaining property with the victim's consent, and of course consent can be a response to the suspect or the assailant's threat, usually to expose the victim to something that they don't want to have exposed. Now, consent, force, and fear, consent and extortion is more in nature kind of choice. It's of a choice. Give up property or suffer the consequences of being exposed. The element of force or fear may be accomplished by one of threats, including things like to do an unlawful injury to the person or property of the individual threatened, or to a third person, to accuse the individual threatened or any relatives of his or her family of any crime, or to expose, them or disgrace them in any way, or again, down here at the bottom, to expose any secret affecting him or her. So these are kind of consent, force, fear, and you kind of get the idea, I'm thinking. Threat of unlawful injury, what does that kind of mean? Well, a threat to do bodily harm to others or to inflict property damage meets the legal requirement of extortion. Threats to expose, or the Badger game, is a type of extortion trick, and I kind of talked about that already. Enticing someone into that compromising position with another, and then asking or demanding money, if you will, under threat of exposure. Hey, if you don't pay me, I'm going to show these pictures or do whatever. So there is a section for attempted extortion, section 524 of the Penal Code. The attempt to commit an extortion is a felony wobbler. To commit the offense of attempted extortion, there must be, again, a specific intent to commit the crime and a direct but ineffectual act. A couple of other sections that fall into this area here would be things like obtaining a signature by threat. Every person who by extraordinate means obtains from another his or her signature to any paper or instrument whereby if such signature were freely given, any property would be transferred, or any debt, demand, charge, or right of action is created, is punishable in the same manner as if the actual delivery of such debt, demand, charge, or right of action were obtained. Section 522. Basically, obtaining a signature by threat. We also have things like sending threatening letters. Oops, let me go back here for a minute. There we go. A couple of other, so we have sending threatened letters with the intent to extort, or a section for threatening letters when the crime is complete. So every person who, with the intent to extort any money, or other property from another, sends or delivers any person any letter or other writing, whether signed or not, express or implying or adapted to imply any such threat as specified in section 519, is punishable in the same manner as if such money or property were actually obtained by means of such threat. So, note that merely sending or delivering a threatening letter containing threats listed in 519 with the intent to extort money or property is punishable as extortion, even if no money or property is actually obtained. So there's kind of an interesting scenario as well. And then finally, the penalty for extortion is listed in 520, public officials, attempted extortion. So you have these sections as well. So here, what I've prepared for you to look at, and this will be the final thing before we end our discussion, is a kind of a chart that helps you compare the elements, if you will, between robbery and extortion. So on the left-hand side, you have the definition of robbery, and then on the right-hand side, you have extortion. And then below it, you have the fear portion. So you can see here, robbery, Penal Code 211, taking the property of another from the victim's person or immediate presence against the victim's will by means of force or fear with the intent to deprive or devalue. Fear and robbery, threat of immediate unlawful injury to, and then immediate and unlawful injury to, and then extortion on the right. Okay, so you can kind of see the difference. So it kind of makes it easy to look at. So extortion, obtaining, need not actually take personal property from another or an official act by a public officer with the victim's consent. So note the difference here on number 3. Induced by wrongful use of force or fear. Okay, and then you have the threat part down at the bottom. So hopefully that kind of helps you see the difference between the two biggies of this chapter here, which would be robbery and extortion. So that's going to be it for chapter 15, robbery and extortion. If you have any questions at all, please feel free, post them on the discussion board. Myself or maybe somebody else will answer them. But if you have something you just want me to know, just send me an email and I will answer that as well. And I'll post a video, also 1 or 2 videos to maybe help add some context, if you will, to the discussion that we've had today on these two things, robbery and extortion. And that will be it. So until next time.